On a quiet morning in Japan, life seemed to move at its usual steady pace. Among these simple rhythms lived a woman named Maki.
お前、全然料理うまくならないな。昨日もサバの塩焼きだったし。
She was just an ordinary person with a heart full of love and a desire to make her home a place of comfort. Maki lived with her husband, a man who cherished the warmth of family life and had a particular love for food. For him, meals weren't just about filling the stomach. They were about memory, emotion, and connection. Every bite of a favorite dish reminded him of his childhood, of meals shared around the family table, and of the love and care that went into every recipe passed down through generations. Maki understood this about him. She wanted nothing more than to nurture their relationship through small, thoughtful gestures. One of the most powerful ways she chose to do that was through cooking. The kitchen became her stage, the ingredients her tools, and every meal an opportunity to show her care. Yet, there was one challenge. Her cooking skills were not exactly polished. In the beginning, this reality was not easy for her. Some dishes turned out differently than she had hoped. Flavors weren't always balanced. Textures didn't always match what she imagined. And sometimes the meals fell short of her husband's expectations. But instead of letting discouragement define her, Maki chose a different path. She decided that growth was more important than perfection. Her husband's love for food, especially those nostalgic flavors from his past, became her motivation rather than a source of pressure. She saw it as an invitation to learn, to try, and to become better, not just for him, but for herself as well. So Maki made a decision that would slowly change her daily life. She would embrace the challenge of learning new recipes. In her neighborhood, people were kind and supportive. She began inviting some of them over to try her cooking, not as a test, but as a way to connect.
ちょっと営業先から相馬ちょっとやったんで。
そう。何買ったの？
コンビニ弁当ですよ。一人身だと作るの面倒なんで、結局こうなっちゃうんですよ。
そんなのばっかり食べてると栄養偏っちゃうわよ。
しょうがないですよ。片付けはめんどくさいんで。
そっか。
温かいご飯と味噌汁食べたいってのもありますけどね。
どうしたの？
パソコンばっかりいじってるんで、目が疲れて。
そう。現代病ね。
そうですね。それじゃあ。
気をつけてね。
はい。
These gatherings were simple, just neighbors sharing food, laughter, and conversation. Yet within these moments, something powerful was happening. Maki wasn't just practicing her recipes. She was also learning how food can bring people together, how feedback can be a gift, and how growth can be nurtured through community.
はい、もしもし。
もしもし、俺だ。
あなた、どうしたの？何かあった？
大した用じゃないんだけどね。
大した用じゃないって、今日何時に帰ってくるの？あなたの好きな角煮作ってるけど。
夕食はいいや。
飲み会かなんか？
実家で食べることにした。
なんで？
お袋の美味しい料理が食べたくなってな。お袋に頼んだんだよ。そしたら作ってくれた。そういうことだから、実家で飯食っ。
At first, the comments she received were gentle but honest. Some dishes were praised, while others received suggestions. And instead of feeling embarrassed, Maki listened with care. She understood that every bit of advice was like a seed that could grow into something better if she nurtured it with patience.
こんばんは。
どうしたんですか、友田さん。
これ、よかったら食べて。
何ですか、これ。
角煮。どうせコンビニばっかりでしょ？
凝ってますね。
素 寝るよりマシだから。
ありがとうございます。
食べ終わったら洗わなくていいから、玄関の前置いといて。
はい。
Little by little, she started to notice change. Her hands moved with more confidence. Her senses became sharper, and her heart felt lighter each time she saw smiles around the table. What began as a simple effort to please her husband was turning into a journey of self-discovery. This part of her story is meaningful because it reflects something universal. All of us, at some point, face areas in life where we are not naturally skilled. It can be easy to give up, to compare ourselves to others, or to feel inadequate. But Maki's choice reminds us of a deeper truth. Growth is not about where we start, but about the willingness to take one step forward and then another.
ただいま。
おかえりなさい。
おい、ワイシャツパンツどこだ。あっちから会社が呼ぶことにした。したいからな。
なんでこんなに入れてるのか。
いや、せっかくだから来週の土曜までいようと思ってさ。これも一人だと大変だし。そうそうそう。
土曜日？
ああ、そう土曜日。じゃあ土曜日に帰ってくるから。土曜日に帰ってくるから、何かあったら連絡して。
Her journey was not about becoming perfect overnight. It was about finding joy in the process, accepting help from others, and understanding that love often shines brightest in small, consistent efforts.
いいから。どうせコンビニ弁当でしょ。
As the days passed, Maki felt a growing sense of determination. Every meal she prepared was no longer just a dish on the table. It was a story, a reflection of patience, and a quiet act of devotion. The kitchen, once intimidating, had become a place of possibility.
お腹空いてたの？
And so,
慌てて食べなくて。
her story begins not with perfection, but with persistence. Not with grand gestures, but with small choices made each day. Choices that would soon lead her to discoveries far beyond cooking itself. As Maki's journey unfolded, the kitchen became more than just a place for preparing meals. It became a classroom, a studio, and even a quiet space where she discovered new strengths. The sound of chopping vegetables, the simmering of soup, the fragrance of rice steaming on the stove. These were no longer random noises and scents. They became the rhythm of her days, guiding her step by step toward her goal. In the beginning, progress was slow. Some recipes seemed far more complicated than the instructions suggested. Certain dishes required precise timing. Others demanded a balance of flavors that wasn't easy to achieve. There were moments when Maki looked at a dish she had worked on for hours and felt a pang of disappointment. But rather than letting those feelings linger, she reminded herself that every expert was once a beginner. Growth could not be rushed. It had to be lived through practice and patience.
僕、何歳だっけ？
One of the ways she encouraged herself was by remembering her husband's expression whenever he tasted something he enjoyed. His eyes would light up, his smile would widen, and there would be an unmistakable joy in that moment. That image stayed with her, pushing her to try again, to keep going, to improve one small detail at a time. The neighbors she had invited into her journey also played an important role. Their visits became a regular part of her routine. Some evenings, 2 or 3 neighbors would gather at her table. Their feedback was gentle yet honest, reminding her of worked well and what could be adjusted. At times, her dishes were too salty. Other times, the flavors didn't blend the way she intended. But each comment became like a stepping stone. Maki began keeping a small notebook in her kitchen, writing down her mistakes, her observations, and her neighbors' advice. Over time, this notebook filled with notes and ideas became one of her most treasured possessions. It wasn't just a record of recipes. It was a reflection of her growth. Gradually, her skills began to show improvement. She started to recognize the difference between rushing through a recipe and preparing it with care. And perhaps most importantly, she began to enjoy the process itself. Cooking was no longer a task to be completed. It was an act of love, creativity, and discovery. One evening was particularly memorable. She prepared a traditional stew, one that reminded her husband of his childhood. Then she invited her neighbors to try it. The ingredients were simple vegetables, broth, and tender meat, but she had poured her entire heart into the preparation. As they took their first bite, there was a pause. Their faces softened, smiling, a smile that held gratitude, warmth, and pride. In that moment, Maki felt something shift inside her. She realized that all the hours of effort, all the little adjustments, had led to this, to create a memory, an emotion, an expression of love that could be shared without words. But the climax of Maki's journey was not just about one successful dish. It was about the transformation happening within her. She was no longer the hesitant woman, unsure of her skills. She had become someone who embraced learning, who welcomed feedback, and who found joy in perseverance. Every challenge in the kitchen had taught her a lesson about patience, resilience, and the importance of embracing growth rather than fearing mistakes. Her neighbors noticed the change too. They often remarked on how her food had become more flavorful, more balanced, and more enjoyable. But beyond the meals, they admired her spirit. They saw in her a person who was willing to try, to fail, and to rise again with renewed determination. The turning point in her story was not defined by a single recipe or a perfect dish. It was defined by the accumulation of small victories, small lessons, and the quiet strength that came from consistency. Through these experiences, Maki discovered that cooking was not simply about technique. It was about connection to her husband, to her neighbors, and to herself. And as she stood in her kitchen, looking at the notebook full of notes, the utensils that had become familiar in her hands, and the warm smiles of those around her, she realized something profound. The journey itself had already given her what she was looking for. As Maki looked back on her journey, she began to realize that the lessons she had learned went far beyond cooking. At first, her goal had been simple: to prepare meals that her husband would love. Yet along the way, she had uncovered truths about patience, resilience, and the power of community. The kitchen had become her teacher, guiding her not only in flavors and techniques, but also in values that touched every part of her life. One of the most important lessons was patience. In the early days, she often wished for instant results. She wanted her meals to turn out perfectly, to see her husband smile without hesitation, to prove to herself that she could succeed. But reality reminded her that growth cannot be rushed. Each dish required time, each skill needed practice, and every improvement was the product of consistent effort. Over time, she discovered that patience is not simply waiting, it is trusting the process, embracing each step, and finding joy in steady progress. She also learned about resilience. There were many moments when her dishes did not turn out as she hoped. These small disappointments could have discouraged her, yet she came to understand that mistakes were not failures. They were stepping stones, opportunities to learn and refine. With every setback, she chose to stand back up, to adjust, and to try again. This resilience became one of her greatest strengths, reminding her that determination often matters more than talent. Perhaps the most beautiful lesson came from connection. When she first invited her neighbors to try her meals, she thought of it as a way to gather feedback. But over time, she realized that it was much more. Those meals became opportunities to share stories, laughter, and kindness. Food was not just about taste, it was about bringing people together, creating moments of warmth that lingered long after the dishes were cleared. Her neighbors' encouragement showed her that growth flourishes in community, and that support from others can turn challenges into shared victories. Through this journey, Maki also discovered something important about love. At the beginning, she worried about whether she could meet her husband's expectations. She felt pressure to recreate flavors that reminded him of his childhood. But gradually, she understood that what mattered most was not perfection. Her husband's happiness did not come only from the food itself. It came from seeing her dedication, her growth, and her willingness to give from the heart. This realization freed her from comparison. She no longer tried to imitate someone else's cooking or measure herself against an impossible standard. Instead, she embraced her own path, her own style, and her own rhythm. She realized that love and effort are what give value to what we create, whether in the kitchen or in any other part of life. The more she reflected, the more she saw how her experience could apply to many other challenges in life. Everyone, at some point, faces something they are not naturally skilled at. It could be a job, a hobby, a relationship, or even a personal goal. In those moments, it can be tempting to give up or to feel inadequate. But Maki's story reminds us that success is not about immediate mastery. It is about perseverance, learning from mistakes, and valuing the journey itself. Another lesson she carried was the importance of humility. Accepting feedback was not always easy, but she chose to listen with an open heart, to view advice as a gift rather than criticism. This humility allowed her to grow more quickly and more meaningfully. It showed her that acknowledging our weaknesses does not diminish us. It strengthens us because it opens the door to progress. In the end, Maki's story became more than a personal achievement. It became a reflection of universal values: patience, resilience, connection, love, and humility. These lessons were not written in books or taught in classrooms. They were lived in the small, daily choices she made. And through them, she discovered a truth that can inspire anyone. Happiness is not about reaching perfection, but about growing, sharing, and giving from the heart. In the end, Maki's journey was never just about cooking. It was about love expressed through effort, about growth born from patience, and about the joy that comes from sharing life with others. What started as a simple desire to prepare better meals for her husband became a transformation of spirit, one that touched her home, her neighbors, and her own sense of purpose. When her husband sat at the table and enjoyed her dishes, the happiness in his eyes was more than appreciation for taste. It was gratitude for the thoughtfulness, the persistence, and the devotion that Maki put into every meal. And for Maki, that was the true reward, knowing that her daily choices had created moments of connection and joy. Her neighbors, too, became part of this story. They didn't just offer feedback, they offered friendship. We grow best when we walk with others, when we listen, and when we open our lives to community. Looking back, Maki realized that the meals themselves were only part of what she had achieved. The greater success was in how she had grown as a person. She had become more patient, more resilient, more open to learning, and more confident in herself. And she discovered that love, when expressed through consistent effort, can turn even ordinary days into extraordinary memories. Maki's story carries a message for all of us. Life brings challenges, skills to learn, relationships to nurture, dreams to pursue, and along the way, mistakes and setbacks are inevitable. Yet these moments are not the end. They are part of the journey. Every effort counts, every lesson matters, and each day we choose to try again brings us closer to who we want to become. What makes Maki's journey meaningful is her intention. She didn't cook to prove herself, but to share care and happiness. That sincerity gave her strength and purpose. She also reminds us that growth doesn't happen alone. Like Maki leaning on her neighbors, we too can seek support, encouragement, and wisdom from others. Her story shows that happiness lies not in perfection, but in persistence, love, and small, consistent acts. With patience and connection, everyday life can become something truly beautiful.